So please join me now in welcoming Kyle Peterson from the Walton Family Foundation.
Over here or here?
I'll give you the center. Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, you too. So thanks for being with us. It's great to have you involved. Great to have the Walton Family Foundation involved in this. I think we all probably are familiar enough with the Walton name to know that the Walton Family Foundation is founded by Sam Walton and his wife, the founders of Walmart in Arkansas. I'm curious to maybe start a bit with. Actually, we were talking this morning, and a year and a half or so in this relatively new role as executive director of the foundation. I asked him, I said, so far so good, and he said, so far so great. Testament to how well it's going so far, and sort of his and Kyle's enthusiasm for this new role. So I'm curious maybe to start at the kind of the high level of the foundation's work and what the foundation's doing, vision for their work.
Yeah. But before I get into that, I was just personally affected by Carrie and Aya. It just goes to show you this work that we're doing is relational, it's personal. And you can talk about big systems, and we'll talk about some of those things today, and big resources, but at the end of the day, this is really about the one-to-one connections that we have. So that was fantastic, Carrie and Aya, fantastic. Yeah. Also, to say when you started that this was a bit crunchy. I think I was here 15 years ago. It was crunchy, yes, but also scruffy. It's not so scruffy anymore. This is amazing. You guys are like spit polished and big time now, big time. And hello to UT friends who are somewhere over there. Way to go. UT MBA, LBJ school. But to this great opportunity that I have been afforded, I'll share a bit. Probably not a lot of people in this room know that much about the Walton Family Foundation. You know about Walmart, you may know about the Walmart Foundation, but as I took this job, I did some, discussions with folks in the social sector, and certainly within certain areas, within K-12 education, where we have a pretty big presence in the environment, we'll talk about that. And in our home state of Arkansas, people know us, but beyond that, we're not very well known. But you should know about this organization. This is probably the coolest philanthropic organization you don't know that much about. And I am just like jazzed by this organization. It's 30 years old. You probably didn't know that. It's 30 years old. They started back in 1987. But it doesn't feel like a 30-year-old organization. It was created by Sam and Helen Walton. And all the spirit and kind of entrepreneurial spirit exists there today. But what's interesting, what's happening is that there's a transition going on at the foundation. It's family-led, very, very much family-led. And you have a transition from the second generation, the kids of Sam Walton and Helen Walton, to the grandchildren. So there are 15 grandchildren who are very involved. And it's a unique place to be. It's got energy. I used to work for a group called FSG, and I hung around foundations all the time. I was in and out of foundations, and what always struck me, and I hope there's nobody else here from other foundations today, you'd walk into a foundation, and you'd literally hear hardly anything. The energy is kind of low. That's not the case at this place. The energy is high, because you've got these 30 and 40-year-olds, young 30-year-olds, who are actively engaged in our work and bringing new ideas. They've lived all over the world. So it's an exciting time, but it's also a legacy organization. So the ideas from Sam and Helen of being rooted in the heartland, and that's kind of an unusual thing too. If you do a heat map of foundations, you'll see most philanthropic dollars are concentrated on the East Coast and the West Coast. Very little in the center. Chicago, yes. This is important, particularly what's happened politically, right? I mean, the heartland matters, and so there's deep roots. We're rooted in the heartland. But this idea of being bold and innovative is coming through with this new generation, and I think it puts the vision of Sam and Helen Walton into real life. And that vision, which was never really articulated, it was there kind of cooking around, but one of the first things that we did when I came on board was to make the implicit explicit. We actually did an exercise of articulating the mission, vision, and values. And the vision of this foundation is to live in a world where anyone can accomplish anything he or she wants to do, given the encouragement and opportunity to do so. And this really is a fundamental part of what the family believes in kind of limitless opportunities. So it has been an epic ride.
Fantastic. Among the foundations involved in a number of different areas, a number of different issues, but one in particular is the issue of conservation, and the foundation has done a lot of work in post-Katrina and post-BP oil spill in the Louisiana Gulf area. So I'm curious to explore that work a little bit, talk a bit about the foundation's focus on the conservation work and what you're doing around Gulf Coast restoration.
And it's big stuff. And this also, like many of the things at the foundation, are really grounded in the family. The family took a trip back in 2010. We were involved in fisheries work in the Gulf of Mexico, and they were actually on a fishing boat when the BP oil spill happened. And they realized, wow, work what we're doing in the Gulf is important, but we have to pay attention to this issue. This issue is going to rock the Gulf in a big way, and this is a crisis, but this could also be an opportunity. And it's turned out that way. The work that we're doing on coastal restoration is part of our entire environmental portfolio, which is grounded in water, which again, it all comes back from the family's love of fresh water and oceans. And essentially what we're trying to do is be very, very catalytic with our coastal restoration work, because it's a big problem. And it's probably something, again, which you all don't know that much about, unless anybody who lives in Louisiana out there. Yeah, well, we're losing a football field of wetlands every 100 minutes. That adds up to a humongous amount of land that is lost every year. And that's a big deal when you lose these wetlands that are at the end of the Louisiana Delta. This is one of the reasons why these storms that have happened, these hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina and others, why they are packing so much of a harder punch. There are other reasons for that, but one of the reasons when they make landfall is because you don't have this protective barrier of the wetlands, and we're losing them at a fast rate. I actually had the opportunity to do a flyover. It was a slow plane flyover of the entire Delta, and I was with a couple people on the plane who were actually natives of this area, and they'd point down, and what you'd see is little pieces of land, but mostly ocean, and they would say, when I was a kid, I used to play football right below here, and you got to be, you can't even conceive because this land has been wiped out. So what we're trying to do is take this crisis of the BP oil spill and turn it into an opportunity. And there's about $15 billion, big money, available for coastal restoration. And through our little efforts to be catalytic, we've brought together groups, and we're starting to make some changes there, which we can talk about, which will almost blow your mind. It's kind of Star Trek-sized changes in the Mississippi River to actually build land and to restore the wetlands, which is unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. If you think about the nature of the problem, right, that Kyle and Walton Family Foundation are working on in the Gulf Coast, it's a big one, right? It's an incredibly complex issue, and one that, as a consequence of that, necessitates the involvement and collaboration and partnership of a whole wide variety of players, right, actors sort of in society to affect change. Philanthropy certainly being one of them. But there's something that's come together called the Coastal Master Plan that I think passed the Louisiana legislature not too long ago.
This year.
And I'm curious to know, like, kind of what the role of, as you think about science being involved, as you think about government being involved, policymakers, others, what the role, kind of what the, to your point about being catalytic, right? What's the role of the Walton Family Foundation in sort of driving that sort of cross-sector, kind of multi-stakeholder collaboration among those sorts of players?
One thing to say, we were not involved in the litigation at all or in the settlement. It really is, what do we do with this amount of resources that are available? And what can a foundation really do, right? I mean, you're talking about titanic forces here. You're talking about the Mississippi River, you're talking about loss of wetlands, and you're talking about hundreds of actors across multiple states. Well, in a small way, what we've done is brought together disparate groups that really had never been together before. That was the first thing, was to build a coalition, and this was fishermen, real estate agents, bankers, politicians, at the state level, at the city level, really anybody you can think of who would have any kind of touch with the coastal area. And that was the first thing, was to build these unusual coalitions, and we actually brought together 5 NGOs that are involved in the environmental area who don't really work that much together. They compete, but they're part of what we call a Mississippi River Delta Coalition. And they together are really the ones who have put this work into motion. What they helped to do was to, first of all, identify that this was an economic issue. So this is not just an environmental issue, that unless you do something about this, the amount of loss that'll happen from future storms will certainly be above the hundreds of billions of dollars. So making it clear to everyone involved that this is affecting the economy in a big way. And that then becomes a nonpartisan issue, okay? The next thing we did was actually to really look at the science and what could be done. You're losing wetlands, right? Football field every 100 minutes. And what can we actually do about that? Well, what you can do is create what they call diversions in the Mississippi River. It turns out that the Mississippi River is the world's most constructive builder of land on the planet. So what happens when the Mississippi River is flowing, it's taking sediment with it all the way down to the Gulf. Now what's happened, and this predates any of us, this is really goes back 50, 60, 70 years, levees have been built, right? You all heard about that in Katrina, and these levees were actually they failed in many cases. But these levees have constrained the Mississippi River in very, very unnatural ways and forced the river to actually divert its sediment into the ocean. So what you can actually do is you can cut a diversion or a channel in the Mississippi River, and you can actually redirect that sediment flow. And that sediment flow can actually build land. And what was unbelievable as I was flying around is you can actually see where they've done these pilot channels, and you can see literally like 4 or 5 square miles of land that are 3 years old, that were not there 5 years ago. And this is the big idea of what to use that $15 billion for, is to divert the Mississippi River to rebuild these wetlands. So a big part of this was actually using science to say, where could you actually make these diversions make the most difference? And so that was also part of the work that we did, but also the advocacy with all the actors that I mentioned, particularly political actors, to make sure that this money would be used for these reasons and these reasons alone. There's lots of needs, in these states, but it's held. And as you said, a big success this year was the passage of this master plan for restoring the coast. And that is a $50 billion effort that will actually, so more money is on the table. Certainly the settlement money is going to kick this off, but this is a big effort over the next 20 years to do what I mentioned, to actually redirect the Mississippi River, to actually rebuild the wetlands.
Fantastic. You've got a perspective on philanthropy that's informed by all the work you did with FSG for years. That's a broad one. I'm curious to know if you think the sort of work that Walton Family Foundation now is doing in sort of coalition building and kind of bringing stakeholders together is somehow reflective of, is that a trend in philanthropy? Are there more,
Yeah.
are there other foundations sort of playing similar roles? Is that
Yeah.
something a little more macro?
Well, I think, people in this room, you've heard of this idea of systems change, right? It's kind of jargony out there right now. I think the idea is if you care about impact, if you really want to get things done at scale, there is no other way to actually get the change you want than building these coalitions. We don't have the resources in sufficient mass to actually tackle this. Nobody does. And frankly, you have to move multiple levers, government, political levers, and nonprofits, and certainly citizenry. So you do need to build these coalitions, and it also has to be sustainable. You don't want to do something and then for whatever reason the political winds change. You want to build a massive support which is localized. So I think whatever you want to call it, and there's lots of things out there, there's collective impact, there's all sorts of ideas, but I do think this is not just a fad. I think for truly strategic philanthropists and change makers overall, and that's you all in the room, I think without pulling people together onto some type of a common agenda, you're just not going to succeed on the impact.
Yeah. Shifting gears just a bit more of your personal background and story. You've had a really interesting and varied career that started in your younger days with a Peace Corps a stint in Sierra Leone, and was followed after graduate school by a lot of really good consulting work with FSG and Monitor, two organizations that probably are of interest to a lot of the students in the room. And I'm curious to know, like, kind of looking back, thinking about your own path to purpose, right? Looking back over this career that you've had, sort of how do the dots connect on some level for you?
Well, it's easier to see them connect when you look back. So I'm also I'm the second 50-year-old, in the room.
Too.
It's hard when you're, 24 or whatever, in the Peace Corps, that's how old I was, or 21, to kind of figure out what you want to do. But absolutely, I was in that experience in being in Sierra Leone, which at that time was the poorest country in the world, and it's, probably top 10 today. It made a huge impact on me, huge impact, and I've never left that. It's never left me. And I think the ability to actually change things, I actually had an opportunity to make change. That started kind of in a micro fashion in the Peace Corps. That's probably only kind of gotten larger the older I've gotten. After my time in the Peace Corps, I went to University of Texas, and I was taken by this idea of international development, but the private sector playing a role. So at that time, there was the discussion about MBAs involved in international development, which is a new idea, but really using the private sector to make change. And so I went with a group called PSI, which is a social marketing organization, and was involved in HIV prevention and malaria prevention in Zimbabwe and Rwanda. And again, so fortunate to be involved in massive change projects. And I think that just got me curious about how funders think and how they put strategies together. And so I sought out my opportunity at Monitor and then FSG. And I think I've been very, very fortunate to kind of been on this path of social and environmental change from the micro, now to kind of a macro platform. But I've never lost, as I said before, kind of that it really is kind of the one-to-one connection that makes a difference. But yeah, there's absolutely a path there.
Yeah. Any parting thoughts for these guys on finding purpose in career and integrating these ideas of making a living and making a difference in the world?
Yeah. Well, one thing, and I was going to write something about this, I think that there's a kind of almost an implicit code that for folks in the room, you're getting your MBAs, that the path should be y'all should make money first and do good stuff later. At least that's the way how I was kind of brought up, probably how you were brought up too.
Yeah, me too.
Right? And there's time to do good stuff later. Thank God I didn't follow that. I left undergrad, went to the Peace Corps, and really never left. It's interesting at FSG because we advised lots of companies. What I learned on the ground in Africa actually are really what companies today are trying to understand, of bringing products and services to places that had not had them. But I'm just so fortunate that I didn't listen to the conventional wisdom, and I would just caution you all, not to do that. There is great opportunities. When I was your age, there were only 3 or 4 interesting places to go. You've got 30, 40, 300, 400 foundations, nonprofits, social entrepreneurship opportunities. Don't follow that path of money first, do good later. Often these are combined today. And in fact, if you want to do good stuff today, there's lots of opportunities. I'll hire you for one. Okay?
That's a beautiful way to wrap this. Kyle. Thank you for being with us today. It's been a real pleasure to have you here, and that's a perfect way to end this around the idea of these, the notion that career is no longer or that service is no longer a post-career sort of situation, which is the way we thought about it when we were young people. There's an entire generation of people today that are bringing a very different perspective about what career and what business can, how that can manifest itself in their lives. So, thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you.
All right. You guys doing all right? Great.